The bell rang, signaling the end of yet another long, monotonous day at Franklin High School. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the classroom windows, casting a warm golden hue across the room. Ms. Elizabeth Gray, a teacher known for her precise, no-nonsense approach to teaching, stood at the front of the classroom, eyes scanning her students with a critical gaze. Her neatly tied brown hair and sharp, rectangular glasses gave her the appearance of someone who valued order and precision above all else. In her advanced physics class, students shuffled papers and packed their bags, eager to escape the confines of the school for the day. But there was one student who didn't seem quite ready to leave: Jonah Williams, a quiet, reserved 17-year-old with untamed curls and an air of mystery about him. Unlike the other students, Jonah wasn't preoccupied with the end of class. His dark eyes were focused on the chalkboard, and his mind seemed to be far away, as though he was calculating something much bigger than the problems they'd been assigned. Jonah had always been different. While the other students excelled in their own ways, Jonah's talents went unnoticed. He rarely spoke up in class, preferring to stay under the radar. But there was one thing Ms. Gray had noticed about him: the sharpness in his mind, the way he could solve equations that even some of the senior students found daunting. It wasn't just his academic prowess. It was his quiet confidence, his ability to stay composed in any situation. "Jonah," Ms. Gray said, breaking the silence in the room, "you look deep in thought. Have you figured out the problem I gave the class?" Jonah blinked, startled from his thoughts. He turned to face the teacher, his lips pressing into a thin line. Yes, Ms. Gray. I think I've got it," he replied softly, his voice barely audible over the chatter of his classmates. Ms. Gray raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his calmness. Jonah had a reputation for keeping to himself, rarely engaging in discussions or drawing attention to his talents. So when he answered, it was always a quiet, unassuming affair. But today, something about his demeanor seemed different. The way he looked at her, as though he already knew what was coming. "I see," Ms. Gray said, her voice laced with an edge of amusement. "Well, why don't you share your answer with the class, Jonah?" The room fell silent as every pair of eyes turned toward Jonah. He was used to this, the eyes of his peers, the weight of their expectations, the looks of confusion and curiosity. He could feel the heat of their gaze on him, and for a moment he hesitated. But then, his hand moved, almost involuntarily, as if his mind and body were in perfect synchronization. His chalk scraped across the board, writing down the solution to the physics problem with a precise, fluid motion. The students watched in stunned silence as Jonah worked through the equation. It was no ordinary problem. It was one that Ms. Gray had designed to challenge even the most gifted students. A complicated set of integrals, derivatives, and forces that seemed impossible to resolve without years of experience. Yet Jonah's movements were sure and steady, each stroke of chalk revealing a deeper understanding of the subject matter. Ms. Gray stood back, her arms folded across her chest, a smirk forming at the corner of her lips. She had a reputation for pushing her students to their limits, testing their abilities in ways that often left them questioning their worth. But Jonah was different. She could see that now. After a few minutes, Jonah placed the chalk down and stepped back from the board. He turned to face the class, his expression unreadable. "Well, there you have it," he said simply, his voice steady. "The answer." The class remained silent for a moment, still processing what had just unfolded. Jonah had solved the problem with ease, his methodical approach revealing a deep understanding of the subject that no one, not even Ms. Gray, had expected from him. It was as though he had tapped into a hidden reservoir of genius, a well of potential that no one had ever bothered to explore. Ms. Gray tilted her head slightly, eyeing Jonah with a mixture of respect and curiosity. She wasn't one to be easily impressed, but she knew when she had witnessed something extraordinary. Jonah had done more than just solve a complex equation. He had shown her something about himself that she hadn't anticipated. Well, Ms. Gray said, her voice tinged with surprise. "It looks like you've solved it after all, Jonah. I have to admit, I didn't expect that." Jonah shrugged, his eyes lowering to the ground. "It wasn't that hard." A few students in the back of the class exchanged glances, their expressions skeptical. It wasn't just the difficulty of the problem that had impressed them. It was Jonah himself. For years, he had been overlooked, dismissed as quiet and unremarkable. But now, in this moment, he had become something more, something they hadn't expected. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Ms. Gray called out to Jonah as he gathered his things. "Jonah, stay for a moment. I'd like to talk to you about something." Jonah paused, turning back toward the teacher. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't often that Ms. Gray singled him out, and the uncertainty in his chest grew as he wondered what this conversation might be about. The rest of the students filed out of the classroom, leaving Jonah and Ms. Gray alone in the now empty room. Ms. Gray gestured for him to sit at one of the desks. Jonah complied, taking a seat with a nervous fidget. "I've been teaching for over 15 years, Jonah," Ms. Gray began, her voice soft but firm. "And in all that time, I've never met a student quite like you." Jonah looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" Ms. Gray leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You're hiding something, Jonah. Something more than just your ability to solve these equations. There's a depth to you, an intelligence that goes far beyond what I've seen in most of my students. I want to know what's holding you back." Jonah hesitated, his mind racing. He had always kept to himself, never letting anyone get too close. It was easier that way, easier to avoid the judgment, the expectations, the constant reminder that he didn't quite fit in with his peers. "I don't know what you mean," Jonah said quietly, avoiding Ms. Gray's gaze. "I'm just a regular student." Ms. Gray smiled, her eyes softening.
No, Jonah.
"You're not just a regular student. You're someone with incredible potential. And I think it's time you stopped hiding it." Jonah sat in the chair, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, as Ms. Gray's words hung in the air. Her gaze was unwavering, intense, like she was trying to see into the very core of him. Jonah shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her scrutiny pressing down on him. He had never liked being the center of attention, never wanted anyone to see him as different. But now, with Ms. Gray's quiet insistence, he felt exposed, as if his deepest secret had been laid bare. "I'm not hiding anything," Jonah said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't like drawing attention to myself." Ms. Gray's expression softened, her voice gentler this time. "Jonah, I understand. I really do. But you have a gift, and gifts like yours are meant to be shared. You can't keep it buried forever." Jonah looked at the teacher, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure what to say. On one hand, he knew she was right. He had always excelled at math, physics, and even other subjects. But he had always felt that being too good at something would make him a target. He didn't want to stand out. He didn't want to be the smart kid that everyone envied or resented. But now Ms. Gray was pushing him, gently, to embrace what he could do. He looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting together. "I don't want to be different," Jonah muttered, barely audible. "You're already different, Jonah," Ms. Gray said, leaning forward slightly. "And that's okay. The world doesn't need everyone to be the same. It needs people who can think outside the box, people who can challenge the norms. You have the potential to do that, but you have to stop hiding from it." Jonah's heart raced. He had never shared his personal feelings with anyone, not even his parents, who had always pushed him to excel. They had never once questioned his achievements. They just expected him to keep up the pace. But here was Ms. Gray, someone who actually seemed to care about why he was holding back. "I don't want to stand out," Jonah repeated, his voice stronger now, but still tinged with unease. "People just expect things from you, and I don't want to disappoint anyone." Ms. Gray nodded, a knowing look crossing her face. "I understand that feeling, but hiding your abilities is the same as allowing others to define you. You need to decide who you want to be, and if you're not careful, others will decide for you." Jonah sat there for a moment, letting her words sink in. He thought about all the years of blending into the background, of making sure he didn't attract attention, of keeping his intellect under wraps. It had worked, mostly, but in this moment he wasn't so sure anymore. "You know," Ms. Gray continued, her tone lightening, "I have an idea. I want to see something, Jonah. Something I think could help you, but also help me understand how far you're willing to push yourself." Jonah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Ms. Gray smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "I'm going to give you a challenge. Not just any challenge, one that will push you to your limits. And I'm going to make it interesting." Jonah's stomach flipped, uncertainty creeping back into his chest. "What kind of challenge? You're good with equations, right? I want you to solve this," Ms. Gray said, grabbing a piece of paper and scribbling down a complex physics problem on it. Jonah's eyes widened as he glanced at the paper. It was unlike anything he had seen in his standard class assignments. It was full of integrals, variables, and mathematical models that even he wasn't sure he had the skills to tackle. He glanced back up at Ms. Gray, wondering if this was some sort of test. "I'll give you 1 hour," she said, watching him carefully. "If you can solve it, I'll make sure everyone in this school knows your abilities. Not just in physics, but in everything you're capable of. I'll help you get the recognition you deserve." Jonah swallowed. His first instinct was to refuse. He hadn't asked for any kind of recognition, and he didn't want to put himself in the spotlight. But Ms. Gray's gaze was unwavering, her challenge clear. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder in his ears. Jonah hesitated. He had no idea what would happen if he accepted. He'd never taken on anything this big. He was afraid of what people would think, afraid of the expectations it would bring. But there was also a part of him, a small part, that longed for a chance to prove himself, to show that he wasn't just another quiet student who blended into the background. "Okay," Jonah said, surprising even himself. His voice came out stronger than he expected. "I'll do it." Ms. Gray smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Good. I think you're more than ready." Jonah took the piece of paper and sat down at one of the desks, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared at the problem for a moment, trying to make sense of the complex equation. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of excitement. It wasn't just about solving the problem. It was about showing Ms. Gray, and maybe himself, that he was more than the person he had let everyone think he was. The room was silent, save for the soft scratching of chalk as Jonah began to work. He didn't look at the clock. He didn't worry about the time running out. All that mattered was the equation. The next hour would be a test of his intellect, his focus, and perhaps his future. Jonah's mind raced as he stared at the complex equation on the paper in front of him. The numbers and symbols blurred together, but there was no turning back now. He had accepted the challenge. The quiet buzz of the classroom, now empty except for him and Ms. Gray, felt like a distant hum. His focus narrowed down to the chalkboard in front of him and the intricate details of the problem. The clock ticked on, the seconds stretching into eternity. Jonah's fingers tapped nervously on the desk, but his mind refused to settle. The problem before him seemed insurmountable. It wasn't just the difficulty of the equation itself. It was the weight of what it represented. This wasn't a typical assignment. It was an opportunity, a chance to step out of the shadows and prove to everyone, especially Ms. Gray, that he was more than just the quiet, unnoticed kid in the back of the class. He felt the familiar pressure creeping up on him, the fear of failure, of not being able to live up to expectations. He wasn't used to failing. He had always been the student who quietly did his work, getting by without ever drawing attention to himself. But now, with everyone expecting him to solve this impossible problem, the pressure felt different. His hands grew clammy, and the numbers on the page seemed to mock him. What if I can't do it? Jonah thought, the doubt creeping into his mind. What if this is too much? He shook his head, trying to push the negative thoughts away. He had to focus. He couldn't let fear control him. His parents had always told him to be brave, to embrace challenges. "You're capable of more than you know," they often said, but he had never really believed it, not until now. Taking a deep breath, Jonah picked up the chalk and began to work through the first step of the equation. The symbols on the board felt alien at first, but something in the back of his mind clicked. The equation had a rhythm, a pattern that began to emerge as he focused on it. Slowly, the tension in his chest eased. He was no longer just copying down numbers and equations. He was solving them, each step leading him closer to the answer, to the breakthrough he had hoped for. Ms. Gray, standing off to the side of the room, watched Jonah with a mix of curiosity and admiration. She had seen students struggle with problems far less complicated than the one Jonah was attempting, but there was something about the way he worked that intrigued her. He was calm, methodical, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that had filled him just moments before. She could see the change in him. He wasn't just solving an equation. He was discovering something about himself in the process. Jonah paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the board as he assessed the work he had done. It was like stepping into a new world, a world where the problem no longer seemed insurmountable. For the first time, he felt a sense of control, a sense of pride in his abilities. He was capable. He was not just some quiet student. He was someone with real talent. Ms. Gray stepped forward, breaking the silence. "You're doing well, Jonah. Keep going. Don't let doubt distract you. This is your time to prove what you're capable of." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Jonah looked up at her, his expression one of quiet determination. For the first time in his life, he wasn't hiding. He wasn't trying to blend in. He was embracing who he was, someone with immense potential. The minutes passed quickly as Jonah worked through the problem, his chalk dancing across the board with newfound confidence. His movements were fluid, precise, each step taking him closer to the solution. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to reach a moment that would change everything. At the 45-minute mark, Jonah glanced up at the clock. His heart skipped a beat. He had only 15 minutes left. The pressure was back, but this time, it didn't paralyze him. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. He took a deep breath and began the final steps of the equation, his focus unwavering. Ms. Gray watched him closely, her expression shifting from curiosity to admiration. She had seen many students struggle under pressure, but Jonah wasn't just solving the problem, he was mastering it. It wasn't just about the math anymore. It was about his journey, his growth as a student and as a person. She could see it in his eyes, the quiet strength that had been there all along, just waiting to be unleashed. As the last few minutes ticked by, Jonah worked with a calm intensity. The final step was tricky, but he had already broken down the equation into manageable parts. The solution was right there, within reach. With a final stroke of the chalk, Jonah circled the answer on the board, his hand trembling slightly with the excitement of what he had just accomplished. He turned to face Ms. Gray, a sense of quiet pride swelling in his chest. "I think I've got it." Ms. Gray walked over to the board, her eyes scanning the solution. Jonah had done it. Not only had he solved the equation, but he had done so with a clarity and elegance that most graduate students would be proud of. She looked at him, her expression softening with genuine respect. "Well done, Jonah," she said quietly, her voice filled with pride. "You did more than solve an equation. You proved to yourself what you're truly capable of." Jonah felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had done it. For the first time in his life, he had taken a chance and pushed himself beyond what he thought was possible. And it had paid off. But there was still something else nagging at the back of his mind, the same feeling that had always held him back. The fear of being different, of standing out. Ms. Gray seemed to sense his inner conflict. She placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a comforting smile. "You don't have to hide anymore, Jonah. You've shown yourself and the world what you can do. Don't be afraid to take that next step. You have so much more to offer." Jonah looked at her, his eyes searching. For the first time, he realized she wasn't just talking about math. She was talking about life. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was someone with real potential, someone who could change the world if he embraced it. The silence in the classroom was broken only by the faint scratching of Jonah's chalk against the board. He stood there, eyes locked on his work, feeling a strange mix of pride and disbelief. He had done it. He had solved the impossible equation. But now that it was done, a new challenge loomed. The next step was uncharted territory for him, the step into the spotlight. Jonah turned slowly to face Ms. Gray, still unsure how to feel. The weight of the moment hadn't quite hit him yet. For the first time in his life, he felt exposed, like a quiet part of him that had always stayed hidden was now being unveiled. Ms. Gray's eyes softened as she looked at Jonah, recognizing the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He had just proven something incredible, not just to the class but to himself. But there was still so much more to unlock. "Well, Jonah," Ms. Gray said quietly, walking up to him with a mixture of respect and encouragement in her tone. "You've done something extraordinary today. But it's not just about solving this problem, is it? It's about what comes next." Jonah looked at her, the confusion evident on his face. "What do you mean?" "Your potential," Ms. Gray continued, her voice calm but firm. "You've shown me, and everyone else, that you're capable of far more than what you've been letting yourself do. But now you need to decide if you're ready to share it. With the world, with your classmates, and most importantly, with yourself." Jonah felt a lump form in his throat. "But what if they think I'm just showing off? Or that I'm trying to make everyone else feel stupid?" Ms. Gray smiled, understanding the source of his hesitation. "Jonah, you're not showing off. You're just being who you are. And if anyone can't handle that, then that's their problem, not yours. You've earned your place here. You've earned the right to be proud of what you've accomplished." Jonah looked down at the chalkboard, the solution he had just written still fresh in his mind. It felt like a distant memory already, the moment of triumph fading as quickly as it had arrived. But deep down, something was shifting within him. It wasn't about the equation anymore. It was about his identity, his place in the world, and whether or not he was brave enough to step into it. "You're ready, Jonah," Ms. Gray said, her voice filled with quiet assurance. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you can do, but it's up to you to decide if you're ready to take that next step." Jonah nodded, though he wasn't sure he truly believed her. The truth was, he had spent so much of his life hiding, keeping his abilities to himself, that the thought of being recognized for them terrified him. It was one thing to be acknowledged in private, to solve equations in the quiet of his own mind, but it was entirely different to share that with the world. Ms. Gray continued, sensing his uncertainty. "I'm going to give you an opportunity, Jonah. I'm going to tell your classmates what you just did, but I'm also going to give you a choice. You don't have to accept the attention that comes with this. You can remain in the background if you prefer, but you can't stay hidden forever. You need to decide whether you'll embrace who you are, or whether you'll keep running from it." Jonah sat back down at his desk, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It wasn't just about solving an equation, it was about claiming a space for himself. A space where he wasn't just the quiet kid who sat in the back. A space where he wasn't just a student. He had the power to define who he was, but the fear lingered. What if people didn't understand? What if they resented him for being different? What if this opened a door to a world he wasn't ready to face? Ms. Gray left him in silence for a moment, letting him think. She wasn't going to rush him. This was a personal decision, and it was one that would shape the rest of his life. After a long pause, Jonah finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, but resolute. "I don't know if I'm ready to step out there yet, but I want to try." Ms. Gray nodded, her smile warm and approving. "That's all I ask, Jonah. One step at a time. You don't have to have everything figured out all at once, but you have to start somewhere." Jonah took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of hope stir inside him. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe he could find a way to be both himself and more than what he had always been. He had already made it this far. There was no turning back now. As he packed up his things, Jonah's mind swirled with possibilities. He wasn't sure how this would all unfold, but one thing was clear. He was no longer the same person who had walked into this classroom an hour ago. He had made a choice, and that choice had changed everything. The next day, the school was abuzz. The story of Jonah's breakthrough had already begun to spread like wildfire. By the time he walked into his next class, whispers filled the air. His peers looked at him differently now, as though they were seeing him for the first time. Some with admiration, some with curiosity, and a few, perhaps, with jealousy. Jonah kept his head down as he entered the classroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want the attention. He didn't want to be the center of the conversation. He just wanted to sit quietly and get through the day. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't happen. As the bell rang, Ms. Gray stood up at the front of the class, her expression serious but kind. She had a story to tell, one that would change how everyone saw Jonah from that day forward. "Class," she began, her voice steady. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge one of your peers. Jonah Williams has just done something extraordinary. He solved a physics problem that none of us thought was possible for a high school student. But he did it. And not only did he solve it, but he did so with clarity and precision that most of us could only dream of." The class fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Jonah could feel all eyes on him, but he refused to look up. He wasn't ready for this. Not yet. Ms. Gray continued, unaware of Jonah's discomfort. "Jonah has shown us that there is more to him than we've all realized. He's not just a student in the back of the room. He's someone with incredible potential. And I think it's time we all recognize that." Jonah's stomach twisted in knots. He had done it for himself. But this was different. This was public. And it felt like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. Ms. Gray finished her speech with a smile. "So, let's give Jonah a round of applause for what he's accomplished. Not just for his intellect, but for his courage in stepping forward and showing us what he can do." The classroom erupted into applause. Jonah stood there, frozen in place, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't like he hadn't imagined this moment in his head, but he had never thought it would feel this overwhelming. Every part of him screamed to run, to find somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. But something stopped him. For the first time, Jonah stood tall. He let the applause wash over him, the heat of his classmates' admiration seeping into his bones. He didn't run. He didn't hide. And in that moment, Jonah realized something crucial. He was no longer afraid of standing out. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about embracing who he was, without shame or hesitation. He had taken the first step. The weeks that followed Jonah's public challenge were nothing like what he had expected. The applause had faded, but the effect lingered, both in the classroom and outside of it. At first, he had hoped things would go back to normal, back to the way they had been before Ms. Gray's announcement. But that was not to be. Jonah's life was slowly but surely being transformed in ways he hadn't anticipated. It started with small things. His classmates, who once barely acknowledged his existence, now looked at him with a new curiosity. Some of them approached him between classes, their eyes filled with admiration. Others seemed unsure of what to say, caught between respect and the old fears of being overshadowed by someone they had never really noticed before. At lunch, he began to notice the subtle shifts, the whispers, the awkward silences as people stared from across the cafeteria. Jonah didn't mind the attention at first, but as days turned into weeks, it became increasingly hard to navigate the complexities of his new social landscape. He wasn't sure if he liked being noticed this way. He had spent so many years blending in, finding comfort in being invisible, that the reality of having his every move scrutinized was unnerving. One afternoon, as he walked to his locker, Jonah overheard a group of students talking in hushed tones. The conversation quickly shifted to him as he passed by. He couldn't help but catch snippets of their words. "Did you see Jonah in class yesterday? I still can't believe he solved that equation. I heard he's been tutoring Sarah in physics. I mean, how did he even know how to do that? He's just a regular kid." Jonah's face flushed. He hated that they were talking about him. It wasn't even the praise that bothered him. It was the sense of alienation that followed. It was as if the entire world was looking at him through a different lens, one that he hadn't chosen and wasn't sure he was ready for. As he spun his combination lock and opened his locker, he saw Tommy, his old friend from math class, walking toward him. Tommy's expression was unreadable, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. "Hey, Jonah, got a minute?" Tommy asked, his tone casual, but there was something in his eyes that made Jonah pause. Jonah closed his locker slowly, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Sure, what's up?" Tommy hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "Look, I just wanted to say that, well, people have been talking about you, and it's kind of different now, right? I mean, you've got people looking at you like you're special or something." Jonah felt the familiar sting of unease. "Yeah, it's weird." Tommy nodded, then leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice. "But you're not, like, feeling pressured to live up to all that stuff, are you? I mean, you know they're talking about you behind your back, right? Some of them think you're, like, the smartest kid in school now." Jonah shrugged, trying to play it cool. "I'm just doing my thing. I didn't ask for any of this." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "No one asks for it, but you got it. And I just want to make sure you're not, getting caught up in it. I mean, you're still you, right?" Jonah's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Tommy sighed, his eyes darting around the hallway to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "I'm just saying, don't forget where you came from. Don't let this whole thing change you, man. You're not better than any of us just because you solved a math problem." Jonah's heart sank. He wasn't sure if Tommy was being supportive, or if there was something else beneath his words. But the weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air, and Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that his friendship with Tommy was now different. There was a distance between them that hadn't been there before. "Don't worry, Tommy," Jonah replied softly. "I'm not gonna change. I'm just figuring things out." Tommy didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, then turned and walked away without saying another word. The next day, Jonah found himself sitting in the back of the classroom, not because he wanted to be invisible, but because the seat allowed him to observe rather than participate. Ms. Gray had returned to her usual teaching style, full of lectures and dry explanations, but Jonah couldn't focus. The weight of the spotlight had crept into his bones, and no matter how much he tried to push it aside, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was now seen differently by everyone around him. During class, Ms. Gray paused and, without looking at Jonah, made an unexpected announcement. "We're going to do something a little different today. We're going to have an open discussion about giftedness and intelligence. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think it's something that deserves more attention." Jonah felt a knot form in his stomach. He hadn't expected to be thrust into this conversation, not so soon. I want to ask you all a question, Ms. Gray continued, her eyes scanning the class. What does it mean to be gifted? Is it about intelligence, talent, or something else? Jonah squirmed in his seat, feeling the weight of her gaze shift briefly in his direction. He wasn't sure if she was trying to make a point or if this was just a random discussion. But either way, he wasn't sure he was ready for what might come next. A few students raised their hands, offering various responses. Some said it was about natural ability. Others said it was about hard work and persistence. Ms. Gray nodded thoughtfully at each answer, but it was when she turned to Jonah that things started to get uncomfortable. Jonah, you've been quite the subject of discussion lately. How do you define giftedness? She asked, her voice gentle but insistent. The class fell into a heavy silence. All eyes turned to Jonah, who felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't a simple question, it was an invitation to define himself in front of everyone, to place himself in a category he wasn't sure he belonged in. Jonah's mind raced, but all he could think of was the truth. He didn't feel gifted. He didn't feel special. He felt like he had been pushed into something he wasn't ready for. He swallowed, his throat dry. I don't know. I think being gifted is about being able to think differently. But it's not always a good thing. Sometimes it's just pressure. Everyone expects you to be perfect, and that's not always something I want. The room fell silent again, and Jonah could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. Ms. Gray looked at him with a knowing expression, but it was the rest of the class that seemed to come alive with a new understanding. Well, Jonah, Ms. Gray said after a pause, I think that's a very honest answer, and I appreciate your perspective. The bell rang shortly after, signaling the end of class. As the students filed out, Jonah couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. But he also knew one thing for sure, his journey wasn't over. The struggle was only just beginning. Jonah had taken his first steps into the world of recognition, but now, more than ever, he had to navigate the complexity of being seen for who he truly was. The next few days were a blur for Jonah. He couldn't quite shake the weight of everything that had been happening around him. Ms. Gray's classroom, once a place of routine and predictable expectations, now felt different. His classmates no longer seemed like familiar faces. Some were more curious, others more distant. Jonah had become a subject of conversation, and that was the part he hated most. He wasn't used to being noticed like this. The feeling was both exhilarating and suffocating. One moment, he would catch someone glancing at him, only to look away quickly when he made eye contact. The next, there were hushed whispers between classes as people passed by him in the hallways. It wasn't just about the praise anymore. It was about the constant reminder that he was now different. He was no longer invisible. At lunch, he sat at the usual table, but it felt foreign. His friends, once easy to talk to, now seemed unsure of how to approach him. They didn't know whether to congratulate him, ask about his big reveal, or simply treat him like they always had. Jonah could feel the awkwardness in the air, thick and uncomfortable. It made him want to slip out of his seat and run somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the eyes of everyone around him. It was Tommy who broke the silence. Jonah, he said, his voice hesitant. Can I sit with you for a minute? Jonah looked up, surprised by the directness in Tommy's tone. He didn't seem as unsure as he had been last time they spoke. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to return to normal. Sure, Jonah muttered, pulling out his sandwich, his thoughts racing. Tommy sat down beside him, glancing around before leaning in slightly. I've been thinking, Tommy began, his voice low, about what happened with Ms. Gray. And, well, I know it's been a lot for you. People are treating you different now. Huh. Jonah nodded. I didn't ask for this. I don't want to be treated like some kind of science experiment or some genius or whatever they think I am. Tommy looked at him with understanding in his eyes. I get that. It's weird. But, Jonah, you are different. You're not like the rest of us, man. You've got something that most people don't. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it's real. And it's kind of amazing. Jonah swallowed hard, his throat tight. I don't want to be the amazing kid. I just want to be Jonah, the guy who solves problems in the back of the class, who doesn't draw attention to himself. I know, Tommy said, sighing, but you are Jonah. You just happen to be a Jonah who can do stuff that other people can't. So maybe you should embrace it. I mean, you could use this for something good, right? Jonah's eyes met Tommy's, searching for any hint of mockery or judgment, but there was none. Tommy was serious. Jonah felt a small flicker of hope, though it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. Use it for something good? That's what Ms. Gray said too, Jonah muttered, glancing down at his tray. She said I had to make a choice. Share my abilities, or hide them away. Tommy smiled softly, nudging Jonah's shoulder with his own. And you know what? The fact that you're even thinking about it means you're already ahead of most people. A lot of people with your talent wouldn't even hesitate, they'd just go for it. But you're not like that. You think things through. And maybe that's what makes you different, in a good way. Jonah took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Tommy's words lingered in his mind, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to make such a big decision. Would he really be able to step up, claim his place, and deal with the weight of expectations that came with it? Would it change everything? Would it change him? As the lunch bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Jonah stood up, grabbing his things slowly. Thanks, Tommy. I think I need some time to figure this out. Tommy nodded, his face full of understanding. Take all the time you need, man. I'll be here when you're ready. Jonah watched Tommy walk away, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He still wasn't sure where he stood, but he had at least made one step forward. He had admitted to himself that something had to change. He couldn't continue to hide forever. The next morning, as Jonah walked through the school's front doors, he noticed something he hadn't expected, a new sense of quiet respect from his peers. No longer were they whispering behind his back. They weren't avoiding him either. There was a strange, almost hesitant kind of reverence in the way they looked at him. It wasn't just his classmates. Even teachers seemed to acknowledge him differently, nodding as he passed them in the hall. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but instead of making him feel uncomfortable, he was starting to feel accepted. Not because he was exceptional, but because perhaps they were starting to see him for who he truly was, rather than just the student who had solved an impossible problem. At the end of the day, as Jonah gathered his things to leave, Ms. Gray caught his attention before he could walk out of the classroom. Her expression was thoughtful, as though she had been waiting for this moment. Jonah, can I speak to you for a moment? She asked, her voice kind but commanding. Jonah nodded, his stomach doing a nervous flip. Sure. Ms. Gray smiled, but there was something in her eyes that was different today. She wasn't just the teacher anymore. She was someone who was trying to understand the complexity of the situation as much as he was. I've been thinking about what you said, Ms. Gray began, walking toward him, about how much pressure you feel now. And I just want to tell you this. I never meant to push you into a spotlight you weren't ready for. But I believe you have something truly special. And I want to help you share that with others, on your terms, in a way that works for you. Jonah shifted uneasily. But I don't want all the attention. I didn't ask for it. Ms. Gray's smile softened. I know. But sometimes, Jonah, the world needs to see what's hidden. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But what I'm offering is an opportunity. I've spoken with the administration, and they're willing to create a program just for students like you. You'd be able to explore your talents in a way that's focused and meaningful, without the pressure of feeling like you're in a race to prove yourself. Jonah's heart skipped a beat. A program? Specifically for students like him? It felt like everything was falling into place, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to take that step. I don't know, Jonah said, shaking his head. What if I fail? What if I'm not what they think I am? Ms. Gray placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes sincere. Failure is part of the process, Jonah. But hiding from the opportunity will be your biggest regret. This could change everything for you. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing to try. Jonah stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew this was more than just a decision about schoolwork. This was about who he wanted to become. After a long silence, Jonah finally spoke. Okay, he said, his voice steady. I'll do it. I'll try. Ms. Gray's smile widened. I knew you would. I'm proud of you, Jonah. You're ready for this. Jonah took a deep breath. The road ahead was uncertain, and he didn't know exactly what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just solving problems anymore. He was becoming part of something much bigger. And maybe that was exactly what he needed to finally embrace who he truly was. The following week, Jonah stood at the front of the auditorium, nervously adjusting the collar of his shirt. The room was filled with students, teachers, and administrators, all gathered for a special assembly. The air buzzed with curiosity, anticipation, and, for Jonah, a deep sense of apprehension. This wasn't just any normal school event. This was his moment. Ms. Gray had arranged for him to speak about the new program, the one designed specifically for students with unique talents. The program would allow them to explore their strengths, learn at their own pace, and, most importantly, be given the chance to flourish without the suffocating pressures of being labeled as different. As he stood in front of the crowd, Jonah's mind flashed back to that first day when he solved the impossible equation. The way the room had gone silent, the way Ms. Gray had looked at him with that mix of pride and expectation. He had promised himself that he would do his best to take this challenge seriously, that he would finally embrace his gifts. But now, standing here with so many eyes on him, he couldn't help but feel a familiar rush of fear. "Jonah, you're going to do great," Ms. Gray whispered from behind him, her presence calming him. "Just speak from the heart. Let them see who you really are." He nodded, grateful for her support. For so long Jonah had kept himself hidden, his intellect, his talents, all tucked away under a veil of self-doubt. But today things were different. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for anyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong, anyone who had been told they weren't enough. Taking a deep breath, Jonah stepped forward and reached for the microphone. The sound of the room slowly quieted, and he could feel the collective gaze of the students and teachers on him. The pressure was palpable, but there was also something freeing about this moment. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for everyone who had been underestimated, overlooked, or written off as too different. "Good afternoon, everyone," Jonah began, his voice steady but not without nerves. "I'm Jonah Williams, and I've been asked to speak about something that's very important to me, something that I hope will be important to all of you. It's a program that's been created to help students like me, students who might not fit the mold, but who still have something to offer." He paused, letting the words sink in. A few students shifted in their seats, some whispering to each other, but Jonah kept his focus. He wasn't going to let the uncertainty scare him anymore. "I used to think that being different was something to hide. I thought that if I stood out too much, people would think I was showing off or worse, being a freak. And so, I did what everyone else did. I kept quiet. I blended in. I didn't speak up in class, even when I knew the answer. I didn't want anyone to look at me and see something other than a regular student. But what I've learned is that hiding doesn't make you invisible. It just keeps you from being seen for who you truly are." The words flowed out of him, more easily than he had expected. Jonah glanced out at the audience and saw familiar faces, some nodding in understanding, others looking at him with curiosity. Felt good, in a way, to finally speak the truth. He had spent so many years running from it, but now it felt like the truth had caught up with him. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face it. "I don't want to be someone who hides anymore. I want to be someone who steps forward, who uses what I've been given to help others see what's possible. We all have something unique to offer. Maybe it's math or science or art or even leadership. But if we don't share those talents, then they don't get the chance to grow." Jonah paused again, his eyes scanning the room. The words were coming to him more freely now, and for the first time he felt like he was truly speaking his mind. "Today, I'm not just standing up here to talk about the program that Ms. Gray and the administration are putting together. I'm here to talk about the kind of world we can build when we stop measuring ourselves by the same old standards. When we stop thinking there's only one way to succeed, one way to be smart, one way to be valuable." There was a murmur in the crowd, a quiet shift in the atmosphere. Jonah could sense the change, the subtle transformation of the room's energy. For the first time, he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every student who had ever been made to feel inferior because they didn't conform to the typical expectations. He was speaking for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. "The truth is, I'm not perfect. None of us are. But that doesn't mean we don't have something important to offer. We need to create an environment where we can all thrive, where being different isn't a flaw, but a strength, where students can explore their talents at their own pace, without feeling like they have to prove anything to anyone. This program is just the beginning of what I hope will be a new approach to learning." Jonah's voice grew a little stronger, the words coming faster now. "I want to be part of that change. I want to use what I've learned, not just in math or science or physics, but in life. And I hope that all of you, no matter what your talents are, will find a way to share them too." He took a deep breath and looked out at the audience. He was still nervous, but the weight of his fears had lifted just a little. He had spoken his truth. He had shared his story, and that was enough. "Thank you," Jonah said, his voice quiet but sincere. I hope we can all find a way to support each other in the journey ahead. The room was still for a moment, but then the applause started, slow at first, and then growing louder. Jonah blinked, surprised by the warmth of the response. For the first time he felt seen, not just as the quiet kid in the back of the class, but as someone who had a voice, a purpose, and a future. As he stepped down from the stage, Ms. Gray was there to meet him, her smile wide and proud. "You did it, Jonah," she said quietly, her voice full of admiration. Jonah nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think I might be ready for what comes next." The days following Jonah's speech were a whirlwind. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had truly stepped into himself. The weight of the attention, which had initially felt so overwhelming, now seemed to carry a different kind of energy, one that he could direct, shape, and transform into something meaningful. The new program, which Ms. Gray had helped organize, was already beginning to take form. Students who had previously been dismissed or overlooked were now being given the opportunity to showcase their talents in an environment that encouraged growth rather than conformity. Jonah, who had once been afraid of standing out, was now actively involved in its development, working alongside teachers and administrators to ensure that it was a space where all students could flourish. At lunch, Jonah found himself in conversations he never thought he would have. Students who had never paid him any mind before were now coming up to him, talking about their interests, sharing their passions, and asking for his advice on how to navigate the challenges of being different. It was humbling in a way, and Jonah began to realize that perhaps this was the reason why he had been given the opportunity to speak out in the first place. Not just for himself, but for others who had felt the way he had for so long. One afternoon, after school, Ms. Gray invited Jonah to stay behind and help with the curriculum development for the program. Jonah had been eagerly looking forward to this meeting. As much as he had feared the spotlight, he now found solace in helping others who had been overlooked, students who, like him, needed to see that there was more than one path to success. "Jonah, I'm so glad you're part of this," Ms. Gray said as they sat down at a table piled with papers, notes, and ideas for the program. "Your insight has been invaluable. You have a way of seeing things that others don't." Jonah smiled, a little embarrassed by the compliment. "I just want to make sure no one else feels like I did, like they don't fit in, or that they're not good enough." "I think that's why you're so good at this," Ms. Gray replied. "You understand what it feels like to be underestimated, and now you're using that to help others see their potential." Jonah nodded, the weight of her words settling in. "It's still kind of strange, that I'm actually doing this. A few months ago, I wouldn't have been able to say any of this out loud. But now, I'm standing up for the people who need it the most." Ms. Gray smiled, clearly proud of him. "You're not just helping them, Jonah. You're changing the whole dynamic of how we view talent in this school. And I can't think of anyone better suited for it." For the first time, Jonah truly believed that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was an advocate, a voice for those who had been dismissed or hidden in the shadows. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But he was ready to face them. He wasn't just solving equations anymore. He was helping to reshape the way people thought about potential, talent, and success. As the weeks passed, the program began to take shape. Jonah worked closely with Ms. Gray and the school administration to identify students who might benefit from it. The goal wasn't just academic, it was holistic. Students were encouraged to explore their talents in a variety of fields: math, science, art, writing, and even leadership. They would be given the freedom to study at their own pace, dive deep into subjects that intrigued them, and work on projects that allowed them to express themselves without the fear of being judged or held back. One afternoon, during a school-wide meeting to introduce the program, Jonah stood alongside Ms. Gray at the front of the room. He had agreed to speak again, not out of a sense of obligation, but because he knew how important it was to keep the momentum going. He had seen the change in himself over the past few months, and he wanted to help others experience that same transformation. "Hello, everyone," Jonah began, his voice steady, but filled with a new sense of purpose. "I'm here to talk to you about something that's been a big part of my life recently, this new program that's been created for students like me, and hopefully like some of you." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. The room was quieter than it had ever been, and Jonah could feel the weight of the audience's attention. But this time it didn't feel as intimidating. He had learned to channel his nerves into something positive, something that would help others understand that they didn't have to hide who they were. The idea behind this program is simple, Jonah continued. It's not about fitting into a mold or meeting someone else's expectations. It's about giving you the freedom to explore your interests, your strengths, and your passions. It's about being who you are, without apologies. Jonah could see the students in the crowd shifting in their seats, their expressions thoughtful. This wasn't just a program for the elite or the already successful. It was for everyone. The students who had never been given a chance to thrive were now being invited into a space where their abilities would be nurtured, where they would be seen for who they were, not for what others expected them to be. I've been given a chance to share my talents with the world, Jonah said, his voice growing more passionate. And now it's time for all of you to do the same. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have everything figured out, but you do have to take that first step. You have to believe that you're worth it, because you are. The room was silent for a moment, but then, as Jonah finished speaking, the applause started. It was tentative at first, as if the students weren't sure whether to cheer or remain reserved. But slowly it grew, louder, stronger. Jonah stepped back from the podium, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if he had said the right words, but he had said what he felt. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care what anyone thought. This was bigger than him. This was about giving others the same chance he had been given. A chance to be seen. A chance to thrive. As the applause continued, Ms. Gray walked over to Jonah, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it again, Jonah," she said with a smile. "You've given them something they didn't even know they needed." Jonah nodded, his eyes bright. "I think we're just getting started." As the weeks went by, Jonah found himself busier than ever. The program was growing, and more students were joining each day. Teachers were beginning to see the potential in students who had previously been overlooked, and there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. Jonah had taken on more responsibilities, helping organize workshops, tutoring students, and collaborating with Ms. Gray to refine the curriculum. But with the growing success of the program came new challenges. Jonah had to learn how to balance his own academic work with his new role in the program. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed, moments when he wondered if he was spreading himself too thin. But every time he started to feel like he couldn't handle it, he thought back to that moment when he first stood up and spoke about the importance of embracing who you are, no matter what. That moment had sparked something in him, a fire that refused to go out. One afternoon, Jonah was walking down the hallway to his next class when he spotted Sarah, a student who had joined the program a few weeks earlier. Sarah had always been quiet, shy even, and her talents in graphic design had gone unnoticed until she started working with the program. Jonah had been helping her with a personal project, guiding her through a digital art piece she had been working on. Today, she looked a bit more confident than usual, a small but proud smile tugging at her lips as she waved him over. "Hey, Jonah," she called, her voice louder than usual. Jonah smiled and walked over to her. "Hey, Sarah, how's the project coming along?" She shrugged, but her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "Actually, it's going really well. I think I'm almost done. I've been trying to push myself out of my comfort zone, you know? It's funny. I never would have tried something this complicated before, but since I've been part of this program, I don't know, it's like I'm not afraid to fail anymore." Jonah nodded, his smile widening. He knew exactly what she meant. He felt the same way. There was a certain freedom in being allowed to fail, to make mistakes and learn from them without the fear of being judged or labeled as not good enough. "I'm glad to hear that. I think you're on the right track. What you're doing is exactly what the program is about, pushing yourself to grow." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and excitement. "Thanks, Jonah. Honestly, I don't know if I would have even started this project if it weren't for you." Jonah chuckled softly, his face flushing with modesty. "I'm just here to help. You're the one doing the work." Sarah shook her head.
No, seriously.
"You've made me feel like it's okay to be who I am, to actually go after what I want instead of just doing what's expected of me." Jonah didn't know what to say to that. He hadn't expected his actions to have such a direct impact on others. But hearing Sarah's words made everything feel worthwhile. This was what he had been fighting for all along, the chance to help others realize their potential, just as he had begun to realize his own. "Well, I'm proud of you, Sarah," Jonah said, feeling a warmth in his chest. "And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all figuring it out together." She smiled, nodding. "Thanks, Jonah. You're the reason I'm even here." As Sarah walked away, Jonah stood there for a moment, reflecting on what had just happened. It wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about being the smart kid, the one who had solved the equation. It was about the ripple effect he had started, a movement where others could stand up, share their talents, and support one another. Jonah's heart swelled with pride, but there was still a part of him that questioned whether he was really equipped to handle all of this. The more the program grew, the more Jonah found himself having to step into leadership roles. He was asked to mentor younger students, help with presentations, and even speak at local events about the importance of embracing diverse talents in education. Every time he was asked to do more, he hesitated. He didn't feel like he had all the answers. He didn't feel like the perfect leader. But then he reminded himself that none of this was about perfection. It was about progress. It was about learning as you go and being willing to try, even when you didn't know exactly where the road would lead. One day, as Jonah walked into Ms. Gray's classroom after school, he found her reviewing some of the latest reports on the program's success. She looked up and smiled as he walked in. "Hey, Jonah," she said warmly. "I've been looking over the data from the program's first few months. The results are incredible. We're already seeing improvements in student engagement, confidence, and academic performance. You've done something remarkable here." Jonah's chest tightened at her words. "I didn't do it alone. Everyone's been involved. It's a group effort." Ms. Gray nodded. "I know, and that's exactly what makes this program so special. It's not about one person leading the charge. It's about creating a community that lifts each other up, that values everyone's strengths. You've set that tone, Jonah. And that's why this is working." Jonah smiled, feeling a sense of pride that he had never thought possible. "I guess it's all starting to come together." "It is," Ms. Gray said, looking him in the eye. "And I think it's time to take this even further." Jonah blinked. "What do you mean?" Ms. Gray paused for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "We've already seen the impact this program is having here at school. But what if we could expand it? What if we could partner with other schools in the district, and eventually outside of the district? What if we could create a movement that encourages all students to be unapologetically themselves?" Jonah's breath caught in his throat. This was more than he had ever imagined. He had been focused on the program at school, trying to help the students in his immediate community. But the idea of taking it further, of reaching even more students, of impacting even more lives, it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "Do you think we're ready for that?" Jonah asked, his voice filled with both excitement and uncertainty. Ms. Gray smiled, her eyes full of conviction. "I think we're more than ready. You've already started something incredible, Jonah. Now it's time to take the next step." Jonah stood there for a moment, his mind spinning with the possibilities. He had come so far, and now the path ahead seemed full of infinite potential. But one thing was clear, he wasn't walking this path alone. He had a team, a community, and a purpose. As the days turned into weeks, Jonah continued to grow, not just as a student, but as a leader, a mentor, and an advocate for all those who had ever felt overlooked or underestimated. He had embraced his abilities, and now he was helping others do the same. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Jonah was no longer afraid to walk it. Jonah's mind was racing with possibilities as he sat in Ms. Gray's office the next morning. The idea of expanding the program beyond their school was both exciting and daunting. He had always dreamed of making a bigger impact, but he never imagined that it would happen so soon. It wasn't just about helping students at his school anymore. It was about helping thousands of students across the district, and maybe even beyond. Ms. Gray was busy scribbling notes on a piece of paper, her face illuminated by the glow of her computer screen. Jonah could tell she was already planning the next steps, mapping out what needed to be done to make the expansion a reality. He had never seen her so focused. It was as if the project had taken on a life of its own, and now the possibilities were endless. "I've been thinking a lot about how we can scale this program," Ms. Gray said, breaking the silence. "The success we've seen here is just the beginning. We need to think bigger. We need to partner with other schools, get the district involved, and eventually create a network of schools where students can come together and share their strengths, their challenges, and their growth." Jonah nodded slowly. He had always known that the program could go far beyond his school, but now that it was actually happening, he felt a mixture of excitement and pressure. How could he help manage something so big? He had already seen the positive changes in the students at his school, but could they replicate that success in other districts? Could they truly create a movement that spanned across communities, schools, and eventually the country? I know it's a lot, Ms. Gray continued, but I believe in what we've started here, and I think we can make it work. The key will be finding schools that share our vision. We need to align with administrators, teachers, and students who understand the importance of nurturing diverse talents. We need to ensure that everyone feels valued and supported. Jonah leaned forward, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He had never thought of himself as a visionary. He was just a kid who had solved a math problem that everyone thought was impossible. Now, he was on the verge of something much bigger, a movement that could change the way schools functioned, that could redefine what it meant to succeed. "I'm in," Jonah said, surprising himself with his own conviction. "I'll do whatever it takes. We can make this happen." Ms. Gray smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "I knew you'd say that. You've already proven that you have the leadership skills to make this work, Jonah. You're not just a student anymore. You're a role model, a mentor, and most importantly, you're someone who's helping to change the narrative about what it means to be gifted. We're going to need people like you to lead the charge." Jonah felt the weight of her words settle deep within him. He wasn't just a participant in this project anymore. He was part of its foundation. And with that realization came a sense of responsibility. He had a choice to make. He could continue to be the quiet, introverted student, or he could embrace his role as a leader and help guide the program to success. "I'll start by talking to the student body," Jonah said after a pause. "I know I can't do this alone, but I've seen how people have started to support each other in the program. If we can build that kind of community at other schools, I think we can really make a difference." Ms. Gray looked at him with a deep sense of approval. "That's exactly what we need. Community. This isn't just about one person leading. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels like they have a place, where everyone can thrive." Jonah stood up from his chair, a renewed sense of purpose in his chest. "Let's do it. Let's make it happen." The following weeks were a blur of meetings, emails, and planning sessions. Jonah worked closely with Ms. Gray to develop a proposal for the expansion. They started by reaching out to the district administration, outlining their goals for the program and how they plan to implement it in other schools. They focused on the program's successes, using data to show how it had positively impacted students' engagement, self-confidence, and academic performance. It wasn't easy. There were hurdles to overcome: bureaucratic red tape, budget concerns, and, at times, skepticism from administrators who weren't sure about the viability of such an ambitious project. But Jonah and Ms. Gray pressed on. They knew the value of what they were offering, and they were determined to make it work. As the weeks went by, more schools started to express interest in the program. Jonah traveled to nearby schools, speaking at assemblies and meeting with teachers and students. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Everywhere he went, he encountered students who were eager to join, teachers who were excited to be part of something new, and administrators who saw the potential to make a real difference. One afternoon, Jonah received an email that made his heart race. It was from a district-wide meeting he had attended earlier that week. The subject line read, "Approval for expansion, next steps." Jonah clicked on the email with shaky hands. He scanned through the message quickly, his eyes widening as he read the final line. "The district has officially approved the expansion of the program to 15 schools in the upcoming semester." Jonah couldn't believe it. This was it. The moment he had been working toward had finally arrived. The program was going district-wide, and it was just the beginning. He quickly grabbed his phone and called Ms. Gray. "Ms. Gray," Jonah said, his voice filled with excitement. "We did it. The district approved it. We're officially expanding to 15 schools." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Ms. Gray's voice, full of emotion, came through. "Jonah, this is incredible. You've worked so hard for this. You've built something that's going to change so many lives." Jonah felt his heart swell with pride. "I couldn't have done it without you. This is our project, not just mine." "Let's get to work," Ms. Gray said. "We have a lot to do, but I have no doubt that this will succeed, Jonah. You've already proven that." Jonah smiled, his chest full of hope and anticipation. The journey was far from over, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready for whatever came next. The first day of the district-wide expansion was nothing short of a whirlwind. Jonah, still in disbelief over how quickly everything had moved from an idea to reality, stood at the front of the new auditorium filled with students from different schools. It was larger than anything he had imagined. A mix of nervous anticipation and excitement hung in the air. He scanned the room, seeing students from various backgrounds, some of them skeptical, others eager, all of them with different ideas and talents. It reminded him of the first day he had stepped into Ms. Gray's class, unsure of his own potential and unsure of how his journey would unfold. But today, Jonah stood there with confidence, not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned to embrace the unknown. He was no longer just a student. He was part of a movement that was changing the way people viewed education, talent, and success. Ms. Gray stood beside him, her eyes filled with pride. "You ready for this, Jonah?" she asked, her voice warm. Jonah gave a quick nod, swallowing hard to calm his nerves. "Yeah, let's do this." Jonah stepped forward to the microphone, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, just like before, but this time, there was no fear. This time, he wasn't standing in front of the students to prove something. He was standing there to offer them an opportunity to be themselves, to embrace their unique talents, and to find their own path to success. "Hi, everyone," Jonah began, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of the moment in every word. "My name is Jonah Williams. You might have heard of me or maybe you haven't, but what's important is that you're here today. You're here because you've been given a chance to step into something new, something that has the potential to change your lives." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "I know what it's like to feel different, to feel like you're not good enough, or that you don't fit in with everyone else. I've been there, but I also know that those differences are what make us stronger. The talents we have, whether they're academic, creative, or even things we don't even know we're good at yet, those talents matter. And this program is here to help you explore them." Jonah could see the students listening intently, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. It wasn't just about words anymore. It was about proving to them that this wasn't just a passing initiative. It was a new way of thinking about education. "I'm not here to tell you how to be successful," Jonah continued. "I'm here to tell you that you already are successful, just by being here, by being you. All you need to do is take the first step to embrace who you are and to trust that you have something valuable to offer. This program is designed to give you the tools, the support, and the freedom to explore what makes you unique. But you have to be willing to take the chance." A few students shifted in their seats, whispering to each other, but Jonah wasn't concerned. He had been there before. He knew what it was like to feel unsure. But he also knew the power that came from taking that leap of faith. "I'm not perfect," Jonah said, his voice growing a little stronger. "I've made mistakes, but every time I've failed, I've learned something new. And that's the point. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to grow, to learn, and to support each other along the way." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of several students who were watching him closely. "So, welcome. I'm excited to see what we'll build together. And I can't wait to see where this journey takes you." Jonah stepped back from the microphone, his heart still racing, but a sense of pride swelling within him. The applause was louder than he expected, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. What mattered was that he had spoken his truth, just as he had done before. What mattered was that he had opened the door to a new beginning, not just for himself, but for everyone in the room. Ms. Gray came over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Well done," she said, her voice full of pride. "You did it, Jonah." Jonah smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over him. "I didn't do it alone, Ms. Gray. This is just the beginning." As the months went by, the program continued to grow and evolve. Jonah and Ms. Gray worked tirelessly to connect with schools, both in the district and beyond. They held workshops, mentoring sessions, and community-building activities to help students find their passions and develop their skills. Jonah saw firsthand the transformation that was taking place. Students who had once been overlooked, ignored, or told they weren't good enough were now discovering their worth and stepping into their potential. For Jonah, the experience was both fulfilling and humbling. He saw students like Sarah, who had once been shy and uncertain, now leading workshops and presenting their projects to their peers. He saw students who had struggled with math and science suddenly finding joy in the subjects, all because they had the support they needed to succeed on their terms. One day, Jonah found himself sitting at a table with several students from different schools, listening to their stories, their hopes, and their dreams. It was a moment he would never forget. These were students just like him, students who had faced challenges, students who had doubted themselves, but students who were now learning to embrace their unique talents. He couldn't help but smile as he listened to them talk about their experiences in the program. This was why he had started this journey, to help others discover their own potential and give them the tools to thrive. After the meeting, Jonah walked outside, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He took a deep breath, letting the reality of what he had accomplished sink in. The program had reached more than just a handful of students. It had become a movement, and it was only just beginning. Ms. Gray walked up beside him, her eyes full of pride. "This is just the start, Jonah. There's so much more to do. But you've made something incredible happen here." Jonah looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," she smiled. "You've done more than you know, Jonah. You've helped change the way people see talent, and you've given others the courage to embrace their own." Jonah nodded, looking out at the horizon. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time he didn't feel afraid. He knew that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And as he looked around at the students who were now part of this movement, he realized that he wasn't just changing their lives. They were changing his too. The future was wide open, and Jonah was ready to face whatever came next. The momentum of the program continued to build, and as Jonah sat in a quiet corner of the cafeteria one afternoon, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. What had started as a small initiative within his school had now blossomed into a district-wide movement. Jonah's speech at the assembly had sparked a change that was rippling through the student body, creating a new way of thinking about education and what it truly meant to succeed. But even as he reveled in the program's success, he knew that this was just the beginning. There were still challenges ahead, challenges he hadn't fully prepared for. The program was growing quickly, and with that growth came the weight of responsibility. Jonah was no longer just the student who solved the impossible math problem. He had become the face of something much bigger, a movement that was reshaping how students viewed themselves and their abilities. Jonah had been balancing his own academic work with his new leadership role in the program. And though he enjoyed being part of the change, there were days when he felt stretched thin. He couldn't help but worry about whether he could keep up with the demands. What if he wasn't enough? What if the program didn't continue to grow as he hoped? What if, despite all the hard work, things started to fall apart? He didn't want to show it to anyone, but Jonah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of anxiety creeping in. He was used to being the quiet, unnoticed student, but now every decision he made seemed to carry a weight. He was leading something that mattered, but did he really know how to lead? Did he know enough? Could he continue to inspire others the way Ms. Gray had inspired him? He was lost in these thoughts when he felt a tap on his shoulder. Jonah looked up to see Sarah standing beside him, holding a stack of papers in her hand. She had a smile on her face, but Jonah could tell something was on her mind. "Hey, Jonah," Sarah said softly, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. "Can we talk for a minute?" Jonah nodded, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. "Of course. What's up?" Sarah sat down across from him, her eyes meeting his with a seriousness Jonah wasn't used to seeing. She placed the papers on the table and took a deep breath. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice careful. "I think we've reached a point where we need to make sure we're not just doing what's best for the program, but also what's best for the students involved. I mean, we've built something amazing, but I'm worried we might be pushing some students too hard. Some of them are starting to feel overwhelmed by the expectations. They don't know how to keep up, and I think that might be causing them to shut down." Jonah's stomach churned. This wasn't a conversation he had been prepared for. It wasn't that he hadn't thought about the pressure that some students might be feeling. But hearing Sarah voice those concerns out loud made it all the more real. "Are you saying we've been pushing them too hard?" Jonah asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah nodded. "I think we need to find a better balance. I know we want to challenge people, but we also need to make sure we're not overwhelming them. Some of the students are really struggling, Jonah, and they're not speaking up because they're afraid to let us down. But we need to give them room to breathe, to fail without the fear of being judged." Jonah felt a sinking feeling in his chest. It wasn't that he hadn't considered the pressure some students might be feeling, but hearing it from someone else, the students who were already speaking out, was different. He hadn't realized how deeply some of them were internalizing the program's expectations. In their eagerness to succeed, they had become fearful of failure. And Jonah realized now that fear was something he had been running from himself. Sarah paused before speaking again, her voice more thoughtful now. "I think we need to reassess the way we're approaching things. We need to make sure that we're offering support, not just pressure. I'm not saying we should stop pushing people, but we need to make sure they feel safe to ask for help when they need it. Jonah sat back in his chair, processing what Sarah had said. He thought about all the students in the program, students who had come from different backgrounds, who had faced their own struggles. And he thought about how, even though the program had created a space for them to thrive, there was still a fundamental truth they needed to face. Growth was difficult, took time, and sometimes it meant stepping back and reassessing how far you could push someone without breaking them. "You're right," Jonah said quietly, his voice steady but thoughtful. "We've built something incredible, but I think we've been so focused on growth that we forgot about the process. We can't just push people to excel. We need to show them that it's okay to take their time, to fail, and to learn from it." Sarah smiled, her eyes lighting up with relief. "I'm glad you understand, Jonah. I just don't want anyone to feel like they're being left behind or like they're not good enough. This is supposed to be a place of support, not one more thing that makes them feel inadequate." Jonah nodded. "I get it. We've been so focused on the program's success, we forgot about the people at the heart of it. We need to find a way to create an environment where they can succeed on their own terms, where they don't have to be perfect to feel valued." Sarah sat back, her posture relaxing. "Exactly. That's all we want." Jonah stood up, feeling a newfound sense of clarity. "Let's meet with Ms. Gray. I think we need to reassess the program's approach, maybe even adjust the pace. We can't expect every student to keep up at the same speed, but we can give them the tools to keep moving forward at their own pace." Later that day, Jonah met with Ms. Gray, and together, they discussed Sarah's concerns. Jonah had already come to the conclusion that something needed to change. They couldn't just keep pushing students harder. It wasn't sustainable. Ms. Gray listened carefully as Jonah spoke, her face thoughtful but not surprised. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when they would need to reassess their approach. The program's rapid success had led them to push for results, but now, it was clear that they needed to focus on creating a healthier, more supportive environment. "I think Sarah's right," Ms. Gray said after a long pause. "We've made such incredible strides, but we need to remind ourselves that it's not just about results. It's about making sure everyone has the space to grow at their own pace, without the fear of being left behind. Let's scale back a little, create more one-on-one time with students, and give them room to breathe. We can still challenge them, but we need to ensure they feel supported." Jonah nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. He wasn't alone in this. He wasn't the only one responsible for carrying the weight of the program's success. Together, they would make it work, not just for the students who had the most potential but for every student, no matter their background or abilities. As Jonah left the meeting with Ms. Gray, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But Jonah had learned something crucial. The most important thing wasn't pushing everyone to the finish line. It was making sure they felt supported enough to keep going. The program would continue to grow, but this time it would do so at a pace that gave everyone a chance to succeed, not just in their abilities, but in their confidence, their self-worth, and their belief that they were capable of more than they had ever imagined. The months that followed were transformative. Jonah and Ms. Gray, with the help of many teachers, administrators, and students, had reworked the program. They found a better balance between pushing students to excel and ensuring they had the support and time they needed to grow at their own pace. It wasn't just about achieving results anymore. It was about creating an environment where failure was seen as a learning opportunity, not a setback. Jonah continued to work closely with Sarah and other student leaders, developing leadership workshops, peer mentoring programs, and group projects that allowed students to support one another. They implemented feedback sessions, ensuring that every student's voice was heard and their needs were addressed. The program had become a true community, one built on trust, support, and a shared belief that everyone had something unique to offer. As the program expanded to even more schools across the district, Jonah found himself traveling to various locations, speaking at conferences, and meeting with school administrators to advocate for this new way of learning. Each time he spoke, he shared not just his story, but the stories of the students whose lives had been changed through the program. The movement was gaining momentum, and the idea of nurturing diverse talents was resonating with schools everywhere. One afternoon, Jonah stood before a large crowd of educators at a district-wide conference. He had been invited to speak about the success of the program and its future potential. As he looked out over the sea of faces, teachers, administrators, and fellow students. He felt a sense of pride and responsibility. This was his legacy, but it was also something bigger than him. It was the culmination of years of hard work, collaboration, and the desire to make a real difference. Jonah took a deep breath and began to speak. When I first stood before a group of students, I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't know if anyone would listen or care. But I did know one thing: I wanted to change the way we thought about success. I wanted to create a space where students didn't have to hide their talents, where they could grow, fail, and succeed without the fear of being judged or left behind. He paused, looking out at the audience. It's been incredible to see how far we've come. But what's even more incredible is the impact we've had on students. Students like Sarah, who never thought they could be leaders. Students who didn't think they were good enough or who had been told that they weren't smart enough. We've shown them that being different isn't a weakness. It's a strength. Jonah felt a lump form in his throat as he spoke. He could picture the faces of the students he had worked with, their struggles, their triumphs, and the way they had found their own voice through the program. It was more than just education. It was about identity. It was about giving students the courage to be themselves, unapologetically. I'm not here to say that we've perfected the system, Jonah continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. But what I do know is that we've created something meaningful. We've created a space where students can thrive on their own terms, where their strengths are celebrated, not judged. And we've built a community where everyone is invested in each other's success. The applause that followed was loud and long. Jonah felt a rush of pride, but also humility. This wasn't about him. It was about everyone who had been a part of this journey. His classmates, the teachers, the administrators, and most importantly, the students who had embraced their talents and found the courage to step into their own power. Later that evening, as Jonah sat with Ms. Gray and a few of the student leaders, they reflected on everything they had accomplished. The program had grown beyond their wildest expectations, but more than that, it had changed the way people thought about learning and success. "We did it, Jonah," Ms. Gray said, her voice filled with emotion. "This isn't just about a program. It's about changing the culture of education itself." Jonah nodded, looking around at the people who had made it all possible. "I never imagined it would get this big. I never thought that just solving a math problem would lead to all of this. But I think I finally understand something I didn't when I started this journey. Being a leader isn't about being perfect. It's about making a difference, no matter how small. And the best part is, I didn't do this alone. We've done this together." Sarah, sitting beside Jonah, smiled at him. "You've changed all of us, Jonah. You've made us see that our differences are our greatest strengths. And that's something no one can ever take away from us." Jonah felt a warmth spread through him. It was a moment of true realization. Everything he had worked for had led to this. It wasn't about his own success or recognition. It was about creating something that would outlast him, something that would continue to grow and impact students for generations to come. As the conversation continued, Jonah's mind wandered for a moment. He thought back to the first day he solved that impossible equation. He thought about the doubts, the insecurities, and the pressure he had felt. But now, standing here, with the program flourishing and students all around him embracing their potential, he knew one thing for sure: he had found his purpose. The journey wasn't over. It would never truly be over. There would always be more students to inspire, more challenges to overcome, and more opportunities to create change. But Jonah was ready for whatever came next. He had found his place in the world, not as the quiet kid in the back of the class, but as a leader, a mentor, and a changemaker. And with that realization, Jonah knew that the legacy he was building wasn't just about the program. It was about empowering every student who had ever felt overlooked or underestimated to find their own voice and stand tall, unapologetically. The road ahead was bright, and he was ready to walk it, every step of the way.